Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Delighted to have you all here and to be joined by this distinguished panel. Before we turn to tonight's events and panellists, I need to address a few housekeeping points. I'm obliged to inform you that this event is currently being live streamed onto the IEA's YouTube channel. It will also remain up on the channel for later viewing. In terms of the event running order, I will give each panellist around 3 to 5 minutes to give their opening remarks before I, as chair, ask a few questions of my own on the event topic. I'll then open the floor to the physical audience to ask questions to the panel. Please note our virtual audience that we will only be taking questions from those here with us in person at the IEA. Of course, I'd like to kindly ask guests to turn your mobile devices to silent, and I've been asked to inform you all that the ladies' lavatories can be found by exiting the Selden room and turning left, making your way down the stairs. The gents can be found by exiting the Selden room, turning left and making your way through the garden. And with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce tonight's event and our panellists. This evening's discussion will be on the topic of UK Global Champions, a global Britain approach to trade and foreign policy. Britain's exit from the EU provides a unique opportunity for the UK to redefine its role in the world. Yet despite the positive narrative surrounding global Britain, there's a lack of detail about what this means. Earlier this year, the IEA submitted written evidence to the International Trade Committee's inquiry exploring the interplay between the UK's approach to trade and its foreign policy objectives. Authored by Matthew Lesh and Victoria Hewson, who join me on the panel, they called for a global Britain approach to trade and foreign policy that supports Britain's global champions. What does a global Britain approach to foreign policy and trade mean in practice? What would boosting UK global champions and British exports and imports mean for the UK economy? Should the UK use trade as a foreign policy tool and as an enabler of a more liberal and democratic world? To that end, I'm delighted to be joined by 4 fantastic guest speakers who will hopefully help us answer some of these questions. First, I'd like to introduce Greg Smith MP, who is the Conservative Member of Parliament for the Buckingham constituency. Prior to being elected to Parliament in 2019, Greg worked in print, design and marketing, serving clients across the manufacturing, medical technology and charity sectors, as well as serving for 14 years on Hammersmith and Fulham Council. Greg is also the co-chair of the IEA's Free Market Forum initiative. Speaking alongside Greg to my left is Andy Burwell, International Director at the CBI, and he joined the CBI as International Director in 2020 with significant experience across government, in policy development and working with global businesses on trade and geopolitics. And he leads the CBI's international and trade teams, helping to inform and shape UK trade, foreign and national security policy. He and his team work with business and government to unleash UK exporting potential and support global business leadership at the fore of the Global Britain agenda. And finally, I'd like to introduce both of my fellow colleagues here at the IEA and co-authors, as I mentioned, of the IEA's written evidence submission to the International Trade Committee's inquiry. Victoria Hewson is Head of Regulatory Affairs and was part of the IEA's former International Trade and Competition Unit, and Matthew Lesh is the IEA's Head of Public Policy and was also the former Head of Research at the Adam Smith Institute. I'll now turn to our speakers to give their introductory remarks, beginning please with Victoria.
Thanks very much, Annabelle. It's great to be here and really pleased that so many people could join us to talk about this really important and possibly one of the few areas of economic policy that we at the IEA can still feel excited and positive about at the moment. The Department of International Trade is broadly doing a good job. We would say, and it's certainly doing a high-profile job. Liz Truss and then Anne-Marie Trevelyan have done a really excellent job of raising Britain's profile around the world in global trade fora. But I would argue that global Britain starts with domestic policy, and free trade agreements and WTO interactions should not be seen as the be-all and end-all of trade policy. Bilaterals with Australia and New Zealand are great news, and of course the trade and cooperation agreement with our nearest and dearest trade partner, the EU, is vitally important. The CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Platform Agreement, the mega regional, is a brilliant opportunity, and I'm really glad that the UK is progressing well on the accession process. We've got a paper on CPTPP accession coming out very soon, co-authored by me and Professor David Collins of City University, going through what the technical process is and what some of the pitfalls that we might still fall into as we move on the accession process. So look out for that. Obviously, the dreams of bilaterals with the real biggies like the US and India seem to be just about alive. I guess unexpectedly, the possible agreement with India seems more feasible at the moment than an agreement with the US, which is probably not something that people in the trade world had foreseen sort of around 2016 when people were getting quite excited about a free trade agreement with the US. So the bilaterals and the plurilaterals and the WTO side is important, and there are some very useful and exciting things happening in that space. But I would say, coming back closer to home, I've been really encouraged to see Jacob Rees-Mogg making such a strong case and actually putting unilateral pro-free trade measures into practice. In the first instance, by holding off implementing checks on imports from the EU, which has been criticised in some quarters for somehow showing weakness and that we haven't taken back control after all. But of course, having more open borders and freer trade in goods and services is very much the kind of taking back control that free trade supporters of leaving the European Union had in mind. And I hope actually that he and colleagues in the government will be able to take this even further by continuing recognition of the CE mark, instead of mandating that all goods will have to be retested and recertified with our new UK CA mark, which seems to be rather mercantilist, protectionist, driven more by, I guess, people in the Department of International Trade wanting to have something to trade up and use as leverage in trade negotiations, rather than by any real need to have a particular new UK mark on goods in our market. And I wrote another plug for one of my papers. I wrote a paper about that earlier this year called Changing the Rules, which was all about this unilateral approach to non-tariff barriers, which is really where we should be much more interested, I think, in free trade than we are. And in fact, when I was part of the International Trade and Competition Unit here at the IEA, together with Shankar Singham, we always argued that the unilateral domestic policies were perhaps the most important of all in giving a sound basis to global Britain. And this is where we could actually show the real leadership and really export our values of free trade and economic liberalism that should really be underpinning global Britain.
Thank you very much. Yes, Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Annabelle, and thanks IEA for hosting this panel. Really nice to be here. I won't repeat a lot of what Victoria just said. I think for me it's three things. One, trade is essential and needs to be recognised as essential to our economic growth and our economic development. I think the benefits for trade are obviously well known. The fact that it drives innovation, drives productivity, exporting and trading businesses pay more, has a wider economic impact. But I think added on to that, post-COVID, you can really talk about the fact that resilience is driven through trade. By diversifying your income streams, by diversifying your supply chains, you really need to be thinking through how that affects your business now. People say to me, obviously, that trade globalisation is not felt by all. Whilst that statement is true, I would also say consumers, businesses benefit from greater choice, benefit from the price reductions through global trade and globalisation. And actually that argument in itself needs to be kind of reinforced, particularly at the moment, because we've seen a great deal in the press, this kind of term of deglobalisation. And this real drive for businesses and consumers and nations to think in a more nationalistic way. And that free trade is really under threat. And we need to think very carefully about that, about how we respond to it and about how we handle that. And I'm sure we'll discuss that more on the panel today. On this question about trade and foreign policy, I'd say two things. One, foreign policy is essential to free trade. You can't decouple them. Trade will continue despite politics. We've seen that. But fundamentally, what you do at home and what you do internationally with your foreign policies affects trade. And that doesn't just talk about what the UK does, but also what foreign nations have done. So you look at what China is doing today in relation to its COVID lockdowns. That is affecting, as it did for the last few years, supply and demand. It does really have a knock-on effect. What you do at home affects other nations, particularly when you're a core part of an integrated supply chain, much like China is, much like the UK, EU, and many nations around the world are. And that is both direct. So what are your policies towards exporting, importing, investment, but also indirect, such as the COVID lockdown, such as what your policies are towards domestic economic growth. And Russian sanctions obviously can't have to be mentioned within this statement as well. Obviously, extremely necessary with the environment and the context within which they sit. But we have also seen that is a real trend on both the impact but also the willingness of nations to turn towards trade policy as a means of achieving foreign policy aims. And whilst business with the Russian sanctions support that, it does come at an economic cost. And I think we need to recognise that and be really selective about when we use trade for foreign policy means. Second point I'd make is the actual reverse. So actually trade is a fundamental strategic tool, not in the sanctions way, for foreign policy. What is foreign policy about? It's about prosperity, it's about security, it's about influence, it's about relationships. Businesses through their supply chains, but also through their overseas direct investment, UK businesses actually should be harnessed by the government more. There should be a greater partnership in achieving UK prosperity, security and influence. And actually, British businesses, global champions, should be seen as an integral asset for our nation. Much like they are in other nations, I think we need to recognise that a bit more ourselves. And actually the trade policy which we exude should also be developed within that context. I'll stop there.
Many thanks. I'm going to pass the mic over to Matthew.
Thank you very much, and really appreciate the opportunity and all our other panellists who've joined us here today to talk about trade and foreign policy, which I think has really become a major issue, obviously through COVID and the way people have talked about trade, and I think wrongly question the value of free trade and globalisation, and then subsequently just the power of trade. I mean, just think about the fact that we've got this almost reversal at the moment when it comes to our relationship with somewhere like Russia, where we've realised the value of imports and our cost dependencies, and how by blocking imports rather than blocking exports and the relative value those have. We focus so much on trying to get things out, but we also need things from right across the world. And I think that's very much the kind of opportunities we have to talk about here today. This fact that we do have an independent trade policy. Unfortunately, as kind of Victoria stated, there are the potential for quite large barriers with the EU, but there's also opportunities to minimise those barriers and trade in new and different ways through recognising standards and reducing tariffs. There's also huge opportunities when it comes to the rest of the world, and that's really where this kind of discussion about global champions has to take us, about things where the UK has companies that are exporting to the world, benefiting the British economy, doing so from Jaguar Land Rover and BP to Johnny Walker. These companies are global brand names that have the opportunity to really I suppose, particularly in the context of the global economy expanding outside of the EU and right across the world, expand their presence significantly, and that has a multitude of economic benefits, as kind of already been discussed by Andy. We know that the more you trade, the more you can specialise, the inevitable swapping of information and innovation that comes from that, the more competitive markets that eventuate. And the fact that the UK economy, comparatively to somewhere like Germany, is actually less open and less trading globally is a strike against our name as a country. So what we can do to expand that, and I think that then it works both ways when it comes to foreign policy. Trade in many ways is foreign policy, and foreign policy is trade. And when we were kind of doing our submission, I was looking at where the UK is putting its diplomatic posts. Not only does the UK have moderately fewer diplomatic posts than countries like Germany and France, Italy and Spain, we also have a highly uneven diplomatic footprint, disproportionately likely to have diplomatic posts in Europe, of course, but relatively few across South America and Asia, where you've got massive populations. And perhaps this is to be expected to some extent. Diplomats do like to go to places with warm weather and stable countries, but obviously to well represent our foreign and our strategic interests, that's not necessarily a good idea. And I think that's inevitably going to have an impact on our ability to support our global trade, especially since embassies often provide expert advice on local markets and practical advice. Although, of course, ultimate responsibility to enter a market remains with the business, and they're going to be the ones who are going to have to figure out the business culture and the market characteristics and the appropriateness for their product of going into a new market. It does seem to me that the embassies and the consulates also have a role in terms of putting those connections, particularly ensuring kind of a stable business environment, both formally through those trade agreements, which provide that sense of security, but also informally on the ground. And then, of course, building those relationships has spin-off effects as businesses do help transmit British values and appropriate business practices, driving kind of a freer, more prosperous world, driving things like better environmental outcomes, better outcomes for labour rights and quality of jobs. So I think there's really big opportunities here when it comes to Britain's global standing, when it comes to trade opportunities. But I'm looking forward to kind of getting into some of the meaty, complex issues on this topic in some of the discussion questions.
Over to you.
Thank you, Annabelle. It's always a risk to go forth of the chance of just repeating what everyone has said before, but I'm very grateful to be here at the IEA. It's somewhere that I certainly feel very at home, and I'm grateful for the whole trade and foreign policy debate being put under the spotlight this evening. I want to begin by absolutely agreeing with something Victoria said in her opening remarks, that the Department for International Trade, I think, is one of the best performing departments that we've got in the government. At the moment, yes, a lot of the trade deals that have been done are the rollover deals from when we were members of the European Union, but the green shoots of a truly global outlook of doing deals that nobody thought could be done is shining through. And I give no better example of that than it was mentioned earlier, that the prospect of a master trade deal with the United States. But let's not forget the work that Penny Mordaunt is doing right now of trying to secure trade deals with individual states. And that is something that is truly groundbreaking and can open up billions of pounds worth of opportunities for British businesses as well as the American ones that reside within those states. One of the master points that I would make, and hopefully this subject will come before the International Trade Select Committee, and that the evidence the IEA has submitted will get a full and proper airing over the road in Parliament. One of the fundamental building blocks that we do have to get over, though, is that having not had an independent trade policy for many decades, subject to our membership of the European Union, is that as a country, we don't really know how to do trade deals. And that is something that we've fundamentally got to get over. And I offer as a part solution to that, if not the full solution to that, something that comes out of somewhere very close to my heart, because it's in my constituency, the University of Buckingham, who, with the leadership of Professor James Tooley, previously of this parish, and indeed Professor the Lord Hannon, there is a new course at the moment, a postgraduate course at the moment designed for civil servants within the Department for International Trade and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office on how to negotiate trade deals and to train our civil servants to educate those that are out there doing the nitty-gritty of these deals, the wherewithal to actually get on and land the best possible deal for the United Kingdom. So that is certainly the first stumbling block we need to get over. Then, of course, we've got the question of new deals, CPTPP, and what we do with what is actually quite an infant deal in the state of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, because I don't think anybody in this room can possibly say that that deal is a perfect one. I give one example from one of my great loves, motorsport. At the moment, within the terms of that deal, if you take a car to compete in a motor race into France, they believe you to be attempting to import that car. Whereas if you are taking a violin in to play the violin in a concert, that's fine. If you're taking a cricket bat over to play cricket, that's fine. If you are taking a motor vehicle to race, they want the full import duty on that on entry. So there are still plenty of loopholes. There are still plenty of things to get right in that agreement. And of course, the never-ending question of the Northern Ireland Protocol. If we can't trade freely and properly and without friction within our own country, what hope have we got of doing it overseas? But as I said, I don't want to repeat everything that's been said so far. So I thought I would focus on one topic that's certainly important to my constituency. It's important to the country. My constituency is 335 square miles of North Buckinghamshire, 90% of the landmass of which is agricultural land. And agriculture has been put up by a lot of the opponents of free trade, by a lot of the opponents of leaving the European Union, as a reason to be protectionist, as a reason not to embrace free trade. We've had all of the frankly ridiculous debates about chlorinated chicken and hormone-injected beef and all of these things. But actually, it has gone much deeper than that. And I was delighted. I brought along a document that I thought I would never see, that was published about a week and a half ago by the NFU, who have been particularly vociferous in their opposition to trade deals, particularly focusing on the imports. And I'm very happy to say they've woken up, because they've produced a document, Growing Our Agri-Food Exports to 2030 and Beyond, where they have now recognised what I believe is the only way to get British agriculture profitable again, and that is to sell more British produce abroad. We all know why British agriculture isn't profitable. It's from decades of being in the common agricultural policy. The solution to that, the way to ensure that British farmers, who, to be a politician for a second, are the absolute best in the world, become profitable in the long term, is to ensure we are selling more British agricultural produce as a premium product to more and more markets overseas. And they've launched a document that talks about a 30% uplift in British agricultural exports by 2030 to exceed £30 billion of exports. Now, to me, that's quite a modest ask, and I think we could strive for more. But the fact that now even the NFU have been so vociferous against some of the trade deals that have been mooted are now talking the value of how to grow British agriculture is really, really important. And I highlight within that, given Matthew some of your comments about where British diplomacy stands, is they have highlighted where other countries have agricultural attaches, have staff within their embassies and their offices around the world, those promoting their domestic agricultural produce. The USA has 180 countries covered by 100 offices. New Zealand has 18 agricultural attaches in 13 countries. Australia has increased its number of agricultural councillors from 22 to 25. The Netherlands is across 79 countries promoting Dutch agriculture. Japan has 76. We are yet to get off the starting block. And whilst the state is rarely the answer to these problems, if we are to land some of these deals and get British industry, British farming, British science and tech across the line, we do need to strike them in the first place. So I absolutely agree that we do need to be looking at how we are shaping our diplomatic mission abroad to be promoting not just agriculture but all British produce. And at that, I think it's best that we get into the discussion.
Thank you very much to all the panellists for their introductory remarks, and it's my privilege as chair to ask the first few questions and get the Q&A part of this evening rolling. I'd actually like to begin really with a follow-on from some of the points that Matthew and then Greg raised around the role of diplomatic posts, and just put to the remaining two panellists, why is this so important? How does it enable connections in local economies? And how does it encourage reductions in barriers? Could we be doing more? And if so, how? Oh, I've got to pass this in. Andy, to you.
Thanks. For those who don't know, I used to be a diplomat for a while, so I've done the job overseas. I do think it's really important, and I do think it's something which obviously DIT are investing and have invested in, and could go further. I think to Matthew's point earlier about the balance between the EU and other nations around the world, I do think that we also need to recognise the importance of the EU as an export market still. It is not, yes, the fastest growing economy in the world, but it's still integral. It's right on our doorstep, and it's something which we should focus also our resource on. But certainly if you are stating through CPTPP, through India, through all the FTAs that we are focusing on, that the Indo-Pacific is the future for our economic growth, then equally you need to resource off the back of that and ensure that our embassies are tooled up to really push that. I think the other part of it is the skill set of diplomats and those in post. Certainly, speaking to colleagues recently, there's a lack of technology skills across the Foreign Office in particular. We're a digital economy, we're a services economy. Do people really understand that within the diplomatic corps? I probably would say not. So whether we need to think about how better to integrate business expertise, business people into the diplomatic corps, into overseas posts as attachments to DIT or whatever it might be, is a question I think on skill sets to both support FTAs, but also, as everyone has rightly said, all the other aspects of trade policy which matter just as much. Mutual recognition of professional qualifications, all the things around standards and the development of future standards. You need expertise for that. And they're not generalist expertise, they're particular areas of knowledge. And we need to make sure we invest in that as well.
Thanks. I mean, I would say I'm a little bit more sceptical about the value of these networks of diplomats. I would certainly prefer to be funding that and focusing our energies on that than on protectionism by the farmers. So in that sense, it is a big improvement. And I think certainly since we have embassies and trade council in all of these jurisdictions, we should certainly be making the most of it and making the most of the expertise and the contacts that are there on the ground, and it's definitely preferable to things like, well, obviously it's preferable to protectionism and subsidies. It's also preferable as a support and incentive to exporters. It's preferable to things like tax breaks that I think others have been proposing. I would also add another key barrier to exporting that is faced especially by smaller businesses is access to finance, and trade finance is pretty difficult. And if you're an exporter and you're relatively new to the idea of exporting, just having some certainty about actually getting your invoices paid and some certainty about the financing of the transaction is really important. And I know the government and the Department for International Trade and UK Export, I think it's called, is quite focused on that. But I would like to understand more about why it is that the private sector and that international banks aren't more capable of providing those services without government support, and what are the regulatory barriers there? What's the reason why they are not serving trade finance to our potential SME exporters? And I would also conclude as well on this that we do need to watch out for mercantilism, because the emphasis on exports, whereas Greg says it is a very refreshing change to hear from the farmers. We mustn't lose sight of the fact, as supporters of free markets, that imports are good too, and there's nothing particularly, we shouldn't particularly be allergic to the idea of running a trade deficit.
Thank you. I'm actually going to give Greg an opportunity to respond to that. Are we at risk of focusing too heavily on exports? And why is it that so many economists, politicians, commentators worry about the trade deficit?
It's a very fair question. I think one of the biggest things, obviously, we have to face at the moment is that over the last 3 presidencies, the United States has become increasingly protectionist, increasingly isolationist, not just economically, but militarily as well, and that does send a signal to the whole world that many others have jumped on the back of. Now, I think in this country, a lot of it has come from, doesn't everything in recent political history go back to the Brexit referendum? But clearly, as I said in my opening remarks, a fear of the import, whatever it might be it agricultural, be it a service, be it education, be it whatever it might be, was whipped up as somehow something that would damage the very fabric of the United Kingdom, as if anything that was ever imported from the European Union when we were in the single market had done that in its own right, that people clearly lost sight of. And actually what it comes down to is, and I take the weight of this on my own shoulders as well, MPs like me, think tanks like the IEA, other think tanks are available in the same space, really get out on the front foot. And I know the IEA does that anyway, so this is more of a challenge to MPs to make the case for why imports are no bad thing. I think it was Dan Hannan. I heard, it was either in an article or I heard him speak a few months ago, openly talking about the import as being the prize. People are looking for what's in it for us. Well, it is the import. It is the product that we now have that we didn't have before, available to consumers, available for individuals or businesses, whoever, to buy that product. And until we get the debate back onto those terms, rather than simply seeing things coming into this country as a threat to us, I think I've said it before. My children possibly wouldn't eat if it wasn't for imports. It seems that all they want to eat is things that can't be grown in our in our climate. Well, certainly when it comes to healthy foods, they only want to eat things that can't be grown in our own climate. So when we turn the mirror back on those that oppose agricultural imports, to use that as an example again, they've got to understand that half the things they have in their fridge and on their shelves they wouldn't have if we shut the door. And it's about bringing it back to that retail politics again, and getting back on the front foot where we've allowed others to steal the march.
Over to you, Matt, on that question.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and the case for imports is too rarely made, and the massive benefits that brings to consumers, and all policy should be, and I think it's Adam Smith described this very well, that, you know, producers get together to conspire against the public, and ultimately it's consumers who we need to focus on in any policy making. One point I will just make on this point, I absolutely agree with Victoria about the point about trade deficits. I mean, trade deficits is great. That means you're literally giving someone, you know, numbers on a machine. In exchange, they're giving you goods. Like, it's a massive victory. But ultimately, in order to import, you also need to export. You need to be able to sell something to the world and then import something else back in. And the more you can export, the more, you know, as a mathematical fact of, you know, foreign currency, you know, exchange, you can then import more. So you can have a more specialised economy, you can have a more innovative economy. You know, ultimately, the greater proportion of our economy that is involved with exports, the more efficient our economy will be, and the more we can then import other things. And this is the whole idea of specialisation. It's that question of, you know, think about something like agriculture, which I think is a great example of it. I mean, very engaged with the Australia-UK trade deal. I thought the trade lobby made some ridiculous arguments, didn't resonate with the public, mostly because the public generally has faith in Australian standards. But it just seemed quite bizarre to me, just the difference in approach between the Australian agriculture lobby, which is all very export focused. It kind of did go through a shock therapy. In New Zealand's agriculture sector, even more so in the 80s, when it liberalised, opened up to the world, massively benefited from that and was able to specialise, become more productive, and then sell high value goods, basically put mangoes on planes from northern Queensland in individually wrapped to go to markets in Japan and get sold for £20 a pop or whatever. Obviously that's not necessarily the opportunity the UK has, but I think the opportunity does have other opportunities in food and drink. It can be more specialised, higher value chain, resulting in higher paying agricultural jobs in the UK that are for export. British consumers will benefit of that larger scale and that innovation as well, whilst being able to import other food products that might be lower down the value chain. So I think these things kind of come together, the imports and the exports, whilst we have this obsessive focus sometimes on exports or sometimes on imports, when they're both kind of a necessary part of the relationship. Technical reasons also the capital exchanges as well, but we can get into the definition of the current account deficit another time perhaps.
You hold on to the mic, Matthew. I just think I've got time for one more question that I can squeeze in before I open it up to the audience. We've talked this evening about boosting existing national champions and turning them into global champions, and I'm just wondering about nurturing and fostering the next generation of global champions. And I wonder what you think the role is for government in supporting SMEs to trade with the wider world post-Brexit.
Well, I think the first step here is ultimately getting your domestic settings right. It's not creating new barriers to, particularly regulatory barriers to company creation. So just being a situation where companies can set up domestically as easily as possible. Something that concerns me quite a lot is the extent of digital regulation we're putting in place. Maybe block your ears, Greg, but things like the online safety bill, the new digital markets unit they're talking about, these are all potentially going to provide barriers. The online safety bill, if you want to set up a platform in the UK, you can have to do all sorts of safety assessments and other the barriers. I don't know why you would then set up a platform in the UK when you could set it up somewhere else. You then have the digital markets unit, which could be a massive issue if you want to, if you are a British company who wants to sell out, you might ultimately have that blocked. And often that's the major exit opportunity for a lot of startups and small businesses. So you might get businesses not existing in the first place as a result of these kind of new regulations and regulatory oversight. So I think you've got to get the domestic situation right and then provide those kind of global opportunities so it can grow as easily as possible. And I was looking recently, at the list of the top 20 digital companies, tech companies in the world, and none of them are in the EU or the UK. And I think that's quite profound. I think we have to ask ourselves what's happened to the fact that obviously the market's not necessarily as big, but the EU market and compared with the UK is much bigger than the US, which is where you've seen all this innovation. And what's different culturally, what's different with regulation, what's different with taxes that has enabled those companies to start up and become very big, and what can the UK, I suppose, learn and what opportunities now for us, and have seen some very good signs, I suppose, in the Queen's speech tomorrow about Brexit opportunities and new areas like gene editing. But I think there's a lot more work to be done in terms of those opportunities to allow those businesses to grow.
Greg.
I absolutely agree with that. This isn't about foreign policy or even trade policy. It is about domestic policy of creating the environment for businesses to thrive and grow and to set up in the first place. And I'm sorry to say we've gone a little bit backwards on that in the last couple of years around corporation tax. The super deduction is very welcome, but we've locked ourselves into a global minimum. Why have we done that? We've got to get back onto the front foot of deregulation, which hopefully we'll see quite a lot of that in the Queen's speech tomorrow, and back onto the front foot of cutting taxes, particularly business taxes, the taxes that act as a barrier to a business growing, to a business setting up in the first place. Because at the end of the day, unless great entrepreneurs and innovators and those that want to take the risk to create a product or a service to sell, not just domestically but internationally, do it in the first place, then there isn't anything to sell. There isn't anything to go to a global market with. And so, that is just straightforwardly domestic environment territory. I suppose globally, if there is an exemplar of this, because I'm very nervous about the state stepping in and saying that's a good product to sell overseas. I'm not so sure about that one because we know where that will lead us. But in terms of a country where we could really look as to who has got it right is Israel. And I spent 5-6 days over the Easter recess in Israel. Went to it's actually an NGO called Startup Central Nation. And it's an NGO that supports those startups. Israel is the startup capital of the world. It supports those startups, not just in their infancy, not just getting off the line and renting an office or whatever it might be, but all the way through their journey and ensuring they are signposted to the export opportunities, the regulatory burdens that they've got to jump over to be able to do that. It's not the state stepping in, it is a third party. Ideally, it would all happen organically, but you've got to start somewhere, and I think there's a lot we could learn from Israel and Startup Nation Central over there to really rocket boost our domestic offer.
Thanks. Andy?
I feel like we're going to violently agree here on a lot of stuff, but I'm going to violently agree and disagree. I think, yes, you need to focus on your domestic economy. Realistically, the way to sustainable growth is to unlock business investment. How do you do that? How do you ensure that businesses are seeking to grow? What are SMEs and fast growth businesses looking for in terms of support? Most of the research has shown the Trade Access Programme, hugely popular, underpinning flights randomly to trade shows is something which SMEs in particular see as a kind of key incentive. But I think also clusters, and I think this point on Israel is a very good one. How do we develop competitive clusters in the UK? When I say competitive, I don't mean competitive internally. I mean competitive externally outside of the UK with Germany, France, Israel, US, wherever. That really, that point of businesses supporting other businesses to grow globally, to build the right expertise, skill sets, knowledge base is really important domestically. Going to disagree violently in terms of it's not all about domestic. It is about the international future as well. We need to invest today in the industries of tomorrow, domestically, but equally we need to set up the framework internationally so that our future industries can then export and grow globally. And that's really supporting the rules-based system. That's really investing in the standards of tomorrow, be that AI, be that quantum, and making sure that UK values and UK expertise are really flowing into that development today so that in 10 years' time, those global champions of the future have somewhere to grow and have an environment which is sustainable and actually fitting for them.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, actually, sort of to what both Andy and Matthew said about, digital standards and digital developments as well, and wrapping it into the original sort of question about foreign policy and values. And that's what really worries me actually about some of the digital regulation that Matthew mentioned, is that talking about, regulating what people can say to each other on the internet and threatening intermediaries, online platforms and search engines with huge fines for not controlling the level of distress or so-called harm that people are experiencing on the internet is sending a really terrible signal internationally about our values concerning open societies, freedom of expression, media freedom, to say nothing of the ability to set up and grow a business in the digital sector. So that does worry me, and it also worries me from the trade perspective that we have our trade department working in fora in the WTO, like the e-commerce group, trying to address and reduce digital trade barriers, and yet at home the Department for Culture, Media and Sport is busy trying to regulate the whole internet, which I feel there's a certain disconnect there that could perhaps be better addressed.
Thank you. I'll now open the discussion up to the floor. Do we have any questions? Yes, I'll begin with the gentleman just in the middle of the front.
Thank you. Obviously, a satisfactory trade agreement with the US would be a huge boost to us. I don't accept this idea that the US is getting more and more isolationist and only interested in its own territory, because there's been a seismic change in foreign policy. The US had no foreign policy until very recently. It suddenly found one with Ukraine. And who, amongst the whole world, is more aligned with the US on Ukraine than the UK? The opportunity now to resurrect negotiations must be greater than it's likely to be again. Why aren't we doing it?
I'll put that one to Greg first.
Funny that. I think, just to clarify my remarks about the US isolationism, I think the political rhetoric of the US through Obama, certainly through Trump, and latterly Biden, has stepped up a political feeling of wanting isolationism or to retreat from the world stage a little bit. I accept Ukraine has changed that a little bit, and some of the changes on tariffs, on steel, and indeed lifting the ban on British beef and British lamb have all been positive steps as far as the direct relationship between our two countries goes. I don't think it's the case that we are not doing it. I think Anne-Marie is banging on the door at the White House and indeed at Congress on a very regular basis. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, Penny Mordaunt is now taking it to the next level of seeing if we can actually, really jumpstart the whole process by doing these deals with individual states. So you've got to remember, actually, some of those states in their own right are bigger economies than a lot of the countries that we actually have trade deals with in the first place, in terms of the rollover deals we've done having left the European Union. There is certainly no lack of will that I can see from my colleagues who are ministers in the DIT or indeed from Downing Street of wanting that US trade deal. It would be the absolute perfect first mega big trade deal to land. If the first mega big one is India, well, great, so be it. But the US would be, it would paint a picture that I think the public would see the positives of very, very quickly. There is clearly some reticence on the US side, particularly since President Biden took office. Some of those undoubtedly, as I understand it, and I am but a humble backbencher, I am not on the inside, revolve around some of the issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol so far, and arguably a misunderstanding not only of the protocol but more fundamentally of the Good Friday agreement. I would argue that the protocol does more to undermine the Good Friday Agreement than it does to uphold it. It clearly, categorically, does not enjoy the support of all communities in Northern Ireland, and that is a fundamental pillar of that agreement. So I think a lot of work needs to be done between the UK government and the US government to really get both sides to understand the position on that. Hopefully the protocol will go away as an issue very, very quickly. If the election results in Northern Ireland last week don't prompt that, I don't know what will. But that's where the work needs to be resolved in the first instance. Then hopefully I see no reason why we can't land that really totemic, big UK-US trade deal, which would be of the benefit of both countries.
Thanks, Greg. Victoria, I'll just come to you to answer on that question. Is now the time, strike while the iron is hot, sort out the Northern Ireland Protocol and get a trade deal with the US over the line?
Well, I ideally wish that were all going to come to pass. I suspect, yes, I mean, Greg's completely right. The narrative surrounding the Northern Ireland Protocol and Northern Ireland in general in the US is terrible and has not been run in our favour at all. And I like to think, and I'm sure, that our diplomats in Washington are working to try and correct that. But I think even more than that, unfortunately, the current administration in the United States is just no more pro-free trade than the Trump administration was. In fact, it might even be less so. And I just see no appetite there for a free trade agreement with the US, with the UK, or indeed any country. I'm not sure there's any major free trade agreements in the pipeline for the US. I hope I would be wrong about that, but then we'd have to then open up all of the issues that would no doubt be unleashed from our side in this country, and all of the fear-mongering about the National Health Service and food safety and so on. So we would certainly have our work cut out to sort of counter all of those arguments. So in one sense, I'm perhaps relieved for my own workload that I'm not going to have to deal with that perhaps in the next in the coming months.
Andy, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, look, I think the point that Greg made about the size of states in the US should not be underestimated. Yeah, 4 of them are bigger than G20 nations. Yeah, they are sizable economic markets in their own right. We are a services-based economy, let's not forget that. And there are many things we can do to unlock, in particular, services trade across the US at a state level. My team in the US equally are working very closely with Penny and DIT on that, and it really is an important agenda, so it shouldn't be pushed away. I think the point on whether a US trade deal is feasible, I think unlikely in its fullest guise at the moment, but we are doing a lot of trade deals globally, and actually there is a capacity point as well here. I know we have been going hell for leather to get everything done as quickly as possible, but actually sometimes you can go a little bit slower and actually negotiate with a little bit more depth and potentially come out with a slightly better deal. So is it a bad thing that we haven't got a US trade deal coming down the line immediately? It's not ideal. But is it a terrible thing? Perhaps not, when we've got others which are looking pretty promising, as you say, India in particular. Just one point Victoria said as well around this issue that, you know, once a trade deal gets going, suddenly everything gets thrown into the trade deal, which isn't actually trade related. Or there are issues which come up about the domestic economy, which aren't actually to do with opening free trade barriers and markets. That in itself is an issue, which I think we have to be very careful of as well. I think the quicker you go and the more success you have in delivering trade deals, the more likely departments will look at it as a means of actually delivering on foreign policy aims and other bilateral aims that they're looking to achieve, and therefore throw it into a trade agreement. That's quite dangerous because it really does reduce our negotiating positions if we're not careful.
Thank you. I'll take a couple of questions from the audience at a time, and then I will come to you, Matthew, to respond to some of those. If I take Felix and the gentleman sitting in front of him.
Great, thank you very much. I think Andy actually just brought up some of it, which is what does the panel make of the proliferation of non-trade chapters, clauses in trade agreements? Is it a good thing that we're seeing, you know, more clauses on whether it's environmental protection, women's rights, sort of human rightsy type things? And I guess with that, to what extent should trade policy be serving foreign policy? Have we got the balance right, or should it be the other way around?
And the gentleman just in front.
I'd just like to ask the panel's opinion on the China question. It's a country that is very authoritarian. It games the World Trade Organization rules. It steals intellectual property. And to what extent should we therefore treat it as a special case and not place too much strategic reliance on imports and supply chains originating in China?
Matthew, I'll come to you first then. I suppose Felix's question really on whether we risk making trade less free with deals that include stipulations of the political and social kind, such as insisting on around environmental issues, female empowerment, that sort of thing. And then to the gentleman's question on China and not having too much reliance there.
So I might focus on the China question and then hand over to Victoria for that. The first question from Felix, as Victoria's been looking at that issue specifically. On the China question, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this as someone who's instinctively a free trader, but also I see free trade as obviously an end in itself, but also an end that can lead to freer societies. And this was the kind of classic argument Milton Friedman made in Capitalism and Freedom and Free to Choose. And you we'll never forget the moments of, Milton Friedman standing there in Hong Kong saying, nobody's trying to escape over the border from Hong Kong to mainland China. They're all going the other way into this freer society. And subsequently to that, China massively, as you kind of point out, opened up to China's benefit and to the world's benefit. I think the world is a much better place for the fact that hundreds of millions of Chinese people have been lifted out of poverty, and that you saw at least the offshoots of an entrepreneurial private sector in China. What I think was subsequently learned is that either due to subsequent political changes or because of just, communists are going to be communists, the turn towards really the state taking back over the private sector in China, just the fact that the Chinese government has the power to direct private companies to spy on their behalf, for example, the fact that private companies are required to have boards that are run by the party, to have workers' boards that effectively mean the CCP is controlling the private sector. I think you've got a pretty strong case here that there isn't much of a distinction between the private sectors and the public sectors in China, as much as they might like to make their out to be when they export to the world, and that we have been perhaps naive in our hope that greater trade and greater openness with the West would lead to greater political freedoms and greater democratization in China. I think it's an argument that's happened elsewhere. I think it's an argument that's happened in Taiwan or South Korea or Japan or etc. But I don't think that's happened in China. So then the question becomes, accepting the fact that China is a geostrategic threat, accepting the fact that you don't want to become too reliant on China, what do you do about that? And I think that's an extremely difficult question. I don't want to be one of those people who says, well, therefore we need to cut all trade links with China. There's something inherently bad with trading with China. I do think that you have to be kind of careful about it and think carefully about it. What we've seen from a lot of companies over the last couple of years is a lot of diversification away from China, starting with the original kind of COVID lockdowns, as well as the trade war with the US, but also just the question of how can I operate in China if my staff can't come and go easily and visit China, as no one's been able to do for the last few years. So already seeing kind of companies organically making decisions to diversify away from China. We don't necessarily need central planning to fix this problem. Where I think we do have to be careful is probably in a few areas. To what extent is foreign ownership by Chinese companies a risk? I think it's probably not a risk if it's a non-strategic asset, but if it is a strategic asset, if it's a piece of land in the UK that's, for example, near where the UK is sending out nuclear submarines in the north of Scotland, maybe there's a genuine case for intervention, and the government has passed, the UK government has passed new rules to kind of block foreign takeovers. What I think though is you need to be careful not to allow these strategic issues to become mercantilist and become protectionist or become justifications for subsidies for subsidies' sake. So you've kind of got to balance these things very carefully. I'm not sure we quite know how to do that yet, but I think it is going to be that question of balance, whilst continuing to I guess try to benefit from what China can give to the world, and as well as selling things to China that might be beneficial to the UK economy.
Greg, I'll come to you. Feel free to tackle both, or China and the proliferation of non-trade chapters.
Well, I certainly agree with Matthew on the China point. I'm certainly not someone that thinks we should just cut off all ties and all links and just turn our backs on them. Free trade in its own right, as Matthew explained, can be enormously powerful. A trade relationship, maybe not a free trade relationship with China, but a trade relationship with China can be enormously powerful in helping the wider Chinese people. But the fundamental question when it comes to any trading relationship with China has to be around trust. A free trade deal, whether it's a tariff-based deal or a free trade deal, to work, both sides have to be able to fundamentally trust each other. And if we can't trust Huawei equipment not to be spying on us, then we shouldn't be going there in terms of opening that up. And that's why I think the government was right to demand the removal of Huawei equipment from our 5G network as it's being built. But fundamentally, I agree with Matthew, and there are huge opportunities for the United Kingdom to be able to sell into Chinese markets, getting back to the exports point. On the non-trade clauses, I think actually this is a really important point, because for the vast majority of countries where that trust question doesn't come into the mix, I think free trade deals have to be purely about the economics. We can't start becoming, too dictatorial on terms and conditions and how something must be done in either way of the trade flow. I campaigned and voted for us to leave the European Union because I wanted to get away from someone else telling us, what we had to do, what we had to abide by, setting out deep regulations, not just on the actual products or services themselves, but going much deeper than that the political union of the European Union did. So I suspect it's not a controversial opinion to have within these four walls, but trade deals should be about the trade, the economics, the flow of goods and services between the two. And then when you do, coming back to actually some of the points Matthew was making in relation to China, when you do have those open trade agreements and you build those relationships with countries based on trade, let's say, getting back into the foreign policy sphere, there are elements of those countries to which we morally disagree with their stance on something, or have some issue with, whether it's environmental or the way that country treats people of different sexualities or races or religions or whatever it might be. Actually opening up those markets and exposing them to perhaps the way we do things is more likely to make a positive difference than telling and dictating them. And I give no better example, actually. I'm sorry, I'm going to bore you with a second motorsport point. Clearly Formula One, which is a great British success story, 7 of the 10 teams are based here, race in some countries which have some pretty questionable human rights records that are pretty different to us, more hostile than us to people of different sexualities, etc. And actually, it's by still going there and having Seb Vettel with his Rainbow Pride helmet and Lewis Hamilton with his with similar freedom-based slogans on his T-shirts, etc., that actually is probably going to do more difference and actually affect more people and get more people in those countries to think, not tell them, but think about the stance of that country than trying to dictate it out in some trade clause that's got nothing to do with the flow of goods or services.
Thanks, Greg. Andy.
China. Look, I think this gentleman was right in saying it's a special case. China is not Russia. It's a fundamental part of our global economy. Yes, different values, and there are many issues in relation to China that we need to address. But we need to appreciate that it is a huge market in its own right. It is fully integrated across every supply chain globally, and let's not pretend it's not. It is. we need to be very careful about our strategic dependence upon China, and I think that the pivot towards the Indo-Pacific and this question on kind of nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever shoring you fancy throwing out tomorrow is a question we need to honestly have a debate about and think about, and businesses are. But there is that key point that actually engaging with the country and businesses are in a pragmatic way, and they need to increasingly do that, also allows us to spread UK values, UK governance, and actually good practice, best practice from British business. And trade allows that. And businesses as global champions enables that. And we should be really proud of that and use that to our advantage. On the question about whether we should be engaging other areas of inter-trade deals. There is also that point of, well, sometimes you kind of need to, or actually the value of the trade deal is worth more to the opposite side than it is to you, and actually the means to achieve a foreign policy aim is through trade policy negotiations. We're not really in that space at the moment, but you could envisage it going forward.
Victoria.
Thanks. So I find the proliferation of non-trade social employment stuff that creeps into modern free trade agreements really, really dispiriting. For me, optimally, a free trade agreement would eliminate all tariffs and quotas between the parties and have some basic provisions for non-discrimination in regulations and services. And I fear that the more you load up complex sectoral specific provisions or provisions around intellectual property rights and protected geographical indications and so on, the more you're then actually going backwards away from the free trade basis and introducing more opportunities for rent seeking and protectionism, and potentially also imposing the regulatory costs on developing countries that there is actually going to hold them back. And when people talk euphemistically about a level playing field, I fear that that's partly what is involved there. And I found, the UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement included more comprehensive workers' rights provisions than the free trade agreements that we were part of in the EU. And for me, it's particularly disappointing to see a Conservative government putting those in, because they're actually laying future traps for future governments who might be more interested in free market policies and deregulation, because then you can say, but you agreed to maintain a minimum wage in your free trade agreements. You'll be breaching the free trade agreement if you reform minimum wage laws. And then, things like chapters on trade and gender equality in the Australia agreement, that's actually in danger of importing quite contested, highly political concepts. What do they even mean by gender? This is not clear. This is a rather controversial subject. So I don't think you can just drop it into a free trade agreement as if it's complete motherhood and apple pie, and isn't going to be used by basically as a job creation scheme or a vehicle for lobbying by NGOs and civil servants. Of course, they always set up committees and cooperation fora, so you need people to sit in the committees. And I'm afraid most of this is the absolute antithesis of free trade. I do query why the current government is so proud of including these kinds of chapters. I'm not sure if it's because they think it'll soothe any potential resistance away, because you can say, oh no, we're not rapacious free marketeers, look, we care about gender. But as I say, I do worry that these things are actually man-traps for potential future free market reforms.
And with that word of caution, I'm afraid I've slightly run over, and we'll bring the formal proceedings to an end. But drinks will continue in the reception area. So if you have any questions that you'd like to put to our panellists directly, please do join us. The bar is open until 7:30. That just leaves me to thank our four panellists, Victoria, Andy, Greg and Matthew, to thank you all, the audience, of course, those joining us on the live stream, as well as here at the IEA's offices. Of course, huge thanks to all the IEA donors who are with us this evening. But please, lastly, join me in giving a round of applause to our guest speakers for this evening.